The sun had barely risen, casting soft hues of orange and gold over the quiet town of Brookfield. Dr. Carter Whitmore sat on the small wooden bench outside Miller's diner, sipping a cup of coffee from a styrofoam cup. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans, he looked like any other man enjoying the crisp morning air. His unassuming demeanor belied his status as one of the most renowned cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, a man whose name appeared in medical journals and whose skills had saved countless lives. Brookfield was a far cry from the bustling city where Carter usually worked, but he cherished the quiet moments it offered. He had purchased a modest house here a few years ago, hoping for an occasional retreat from the high-pressure environment of hospital operating rooms. The locals had grown used to seeing him around, but few truly knew him to them. He was just the quiet guy with the nice car, an outsider who kept to himself. Carter liked it that way. Fame wasn't something he courted, and he had long ago learned that blending in was often easier than standing out, especially as a successful black man in predominantly white spaces. Brookfield was no exception. While the town prided itself on its neighborly charm, Carter had noticed the subtle signs of unease whenever he ventured too far into unfamiliar spaces. The averted gazes, the polite but guarded smiles, the whispers that quieted when he walked by. This morning was no different inside the diner. The clatter of plates and hum of conversation filled the air, but as Carter stepped through the door, a noticeable shift occurred. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with a warm but wary smile, glanced at him quickly before returning her focus to the counter. A man at the far table paused mid-sentence, his eyes flickering toward Carter before continuing his conversation in a quieter tone. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was enough to remind Carter that, here in Brookfield, he was still the other. He approached the counter, his steps measured and unhurried. "Morning, Dr. Whitmore," the cashier said, her voice pleasant but clipped. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," he replied with a polite nod. He'd made it a point to learn people's names in town. It seemed to soften their discomfort, even if only a little. "What can I get you today?" she asked, flipping open her notepad. "Just a coffee to go," Carter said, sliding a $5 bill across the counter. "And how's your son doing, Tommy? Right, still playing baseball?" The woman's lips curled into a genuine smile, her posture relaxing slightly. "He's doing well, thank you. Got a game this weekend, actually." "Glad to hear it. Best of luck to him," Carter said warmly. As Mrs. Thompson turned to pour his coffee, Carter scanned the diner. It was a mix of Brookfield regulars, farmers, small business owners, retirees, all immersed in their routines. Yet, despite the surface-level normalcy, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered beneath the surface. A quiet tension. The door swung open, and a man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside, boots clunking heavily against the tiled floor. Sheriff Tom Winslow was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by years of small-town politics and long days patrolling Brookfield's outskirts. His presence commanded attention, and it was clear he enjoyed the authority his position afforded him. "Morning, folks," Winslow drawled, tipping his hat to the room. His eyes settled on Carter, and for a moment, his smile faltered. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, his tone unreadable. "Sheriff," Carter replied with a polite nod. Winslow took a seat at the counter, not far from where Carter stood. "How's life treating you these days?" he asked, the question casual on the surface, but laced with an undertone Carter had grown adept at recognizing. "Can't complain," Carter said evenly, meeting Winslow's gaze. "And you?" "Busy," Winslow replied, his smile tightening. "You know how it is, small town like this, always something going on." Carter didn't respond, sensing that the sheriff wasn't finished. "Speaking of which," Winslow continued, leaning slightly closer, "we've had some break-ins around town lately. Nothing major, just a few tools missing from sheds, things like that, but people are on edge. Guess that's why I'm out and about this early." Carter nodded, unsure where the conversation was headed. "Good to know you're keeping an eye on things." Winslow's gaze lingered on him for a beat too long before he straightened. "That's my job," he said, his tone light again. Mrs. Thompson returned with Carter's coffee, and he thanked her before heading for the door. As he stepped outside, the morning air felt colder than before. He couldn't shake the sense that the sheriff's words had been more than just small talk. Winslow's reputation for subtle intimidation wasn't lost on Carter, and the mention of break-ins felt pointed. Carter tried to brush it off as he walked back to his car, but the unease clung to him. He was no stranger to moments like these, moments where his success, his education, and his accomplishments were overshadowed by the assumptions people made based on his appearance. It wasn't new, but it was exhausting. As he slid into the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, he noticed two older men on the sidewalk watching him. Their expressions were neutral, but their prolonged stares said enough. He gave them a polite nod before pulling away from the curb, the tension in his chest only easing once the diner was far behind him. Brookfield's charm had its limits, and Carter knew that no amount of coffee or small talk could completely dissolve the barriers that existed. Still, he was determined not to let it consume him. He had come to this town for peace, for a break from the relentless pace of his professional life. He wasn't about to let whispers and sideways glances rob him of that. But as the morning unfolded and Carter returned home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something was brewing beneath Brookfield's quiet surface. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to rise. This opening section introduces Carter Whitmore, a highly accomplished yet humble individual, and sets the stage for the brewing conflict in the small town of Brookfield. The subtle prejudices and societal tensions are woven into the interactions, creating an atmosphere of quiet unease that hints at the challenges ahead. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Brookfield Hardware, casting long shadows across the aisles stocked with tools, paint cans, and gardening supplies. Carter Whitmore browsed the shelves, his hands in his pockets, as he took his time scanning for the right size wrench he needed for a minor repair at home. The store smelled faintly of sawdust and metal, a comforting scent that reminded him of his father's workshop back in Atlanta. Carter wasn't in a hurry. This was supposed to be one of those rare leisurely days where he could unwind. But as he moved through the store, he noticed the faint yet unmistakable feeling of being watched. A younger clerk at the register, a pale, wiry man with unkempt hair, glanced at him every few seconds before turning his attention back to folding paper bags. Two other customers, a middle-aged man and woman, stood near the gardening section, whispering to each other while occasionally glancing in Carter's direction. It wasn't subtle, and Carter's years of experience navigating such situations told him exactly what was happening. He'd been in this position too many times before. Stay calm, he reminded himself, taking a measured breath. He finally found the wrench he needed and headed for the register. As he approached, the young clerk stiffened, his eyes darting toward the back of the store, where an older man, clearly the manager, was arranging boxes on a shelf. The clerk called out, his voice higher than necessary. "Mr. Dugan, can you come up here a sec?" The manager, a burly man with a graying beard and a no-nonsense demeanor, straightened and made his way to the counter. His eyes scanned Carter quickly, narrowing slightly, though he tried to mask his suspicion with a forced smile. "Afternoon," Mr. Dugan said gruffly, his voice heavy with the kind of authority Carter knew too well. "Find everything you need?" "I did," Carter replied evenly, placing the wrench on the counter and pulling out his wallet. The manager barely glanced at the wrench before his gaze shifted to Carter's hands, his wallet, then back to his face. It was a subtle thing, but the implication hung in the air. What's he really doing here? "That'll be $12.79, the clerk said, his voice wavering slightly. Carter handed over a $20 bill, his expression calm despite the heat rising in his chest. As the clerk rang up the transaction, Mr. Dugan continued to hover, his eyes never leaving Carter. When the clerk handed back the change, the manager finally spoke again, his tone casual but pointed. "You new in town?" "Not exactly," Carter replied, pocketing the change. "I've had a place here for a few years." "Ah." Mr. Dugan nodded slowly, as if weighing Carter's words. "You renting or buying?" "Buying," Carter said, his tone firm but polite. The manager's eyebrows lifted slightly, his smile tight. "Well, isn't that nice? Not too many folks moving into Brookfield these days." Carter didn't bother responding to the veiled remark. Instead, he offered a brief nod and picked up the bag containing the wrench. "Have a good day," he said, his voice steady, despite the growing knot in his stomach. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of the older couple in the gardening section. They quickly averted their eyes, pretending to examine a packet of seeds. Carter stepped outside, the bell above the door jingling behind him, and let out a slow breath. The interaction, though brief, had left him simmering with frustration. By the time Carter pulled into his driveway, the unease from the hardware store hadn't dissipated. He parked his car and stepped out, appreciating the quiet of his neighborhood. The street was lined with modest homes, each with neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. It was the kind of place that should have felt welcoming, but today, the tension lingered. As he walked up the steps to his front door, he noticed a police cruiser parked at the corner of the street. Sheriff Winslow was leaning against the car, his arms crossed, and his gaze fixed on Carter's house. Carter stopped mid-step, his heartbeat quickening. He briefly considered ignoring the sheriff, but Winslow raised a hand in a half-wave, making it clear that he wanted to talk. Carter approached the sidewalk, his posture relaxed, despite the churn of frustration and wariness building inside him. "Afternoon, Dr. Whitmore," Winslow said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Got a minute?" "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Carter asked, keeping his voice calm. Winslow shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Just thought I'd check in. Like I mentioned earlier, we've had some reports of suspicious activity around town. Wanted to make sure you hadn't noticed anything unusual." "Nothing out of the ordinary," Carter replied. "Is there something specific I should be aware of?" Winslow tilted his head slightly, his gaze scrutinizing. "Just a few folks mentioning seeing unfamiliar faces around. You know how people can get nervous when they don't recognize someone." Carter resisted the urge to sigh. "I'll keep an eye out," he said diplomatically. Winslow didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone lowering. "You were at the hardware store earlier, right? Had a few folks mention you looked out of place." There it was, the veiled accusation Carter had been waiting for. "I was picking up a wrench," Carter said flatly. "Didn't realize that was unusual." Winslow chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You know how it is, small townspeople like to know who's who." Carter's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "If there's nothing else, Sheriff, I've got work to do." Winslow studied him for another moment before finally nodding. "Of course, just doing my job, you understand?" "Understood," Carter replied curtly, turning back toward his house. As he climbed the steps to his door, the weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders. Inside, he dropped the bag from the hardware store on the counter and stood in the silence of his kitchen, his hands braced against the cool granite countertop. He took a deep breath, willing himself to let go of the tension that had built up over the past few hours. But the frustration lingered. No matter how far he'd come, no matter his achievements or the life he'd built, moments like these reminded him that, to some people, he would always be reduced to a set of assumptions. For now, Carter pushed the thoughts aside. He had faced worse before, and he would again if he had to. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Brookfield's quiet unease was just the beginning. This section develops the tension by introducing subtle and overt examples of prejudice, highlighting Carter's struggle to maintain his composure while dealing with the biases of others. The unease builds steadily, setting the stage for a more intense conflict to come. The small-town diner was packed that evening, buzzing with conversation and the occasional clatter of plates. Carter Whitmore sat alone at a corner booth, his laptop open as he reviewed documents for an upcoming project. The familiar din of the diner usually provided a soothing backdrop for his work, but tonight felt different. He could feel the weight of the stares from across the room, the whispered conversations punctuated by not-so-subtle glances in his direction. It started innocuously enough, people pausing just a beat too long as they walked past his booth, muttered comments that were just loud enough for him to catch fragments of, "Doesn't belong," and "Showing off with that fancy car of his." Carter tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of him, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The door jingled as it swung open, and Carter glanced up to see Officer Daniels enter, his uniform crisp and his presence commanding. Daniels scanned the room, his gaze landing squarely on Carter. The officer made his way over, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. "Evening, Dr. Whitmore," Daniels said, his voice carrying a practiced politeness that barely masked his disdain. "Mind if I sit?" Carter closed his laptop slowly and gestured to the seat across from him. What can I do for you, officer? Daniels leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I've been hearing some concerns about you folks around town are saying you've been acting a little suspicious. Carter raised an eyebrow. Suspicious how? Daniels shrugged, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Oh, you know how people get someone sees a stranger lingering too long, and suddenly they're worried. Just thought I'd check in, make sure everything's all right. Carter met his gaze evenly, refusing to let the implication pass. I've lived in Brookfield for over 3 years, officer. I wouldn't call myself a stranger. Daniels chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. 3 years isn't much compared to folks who've been here their whole lives. You'd understand if people are a little wary. The diner had gone silent. Every eye was on their table. The hum of conversation, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Carter felt the pressure mounting, a familiar frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Is there something specific you want to address, officer? Or is this just a casual visit? Carter asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. Daniels's smirk faltered, replaced by a more serious expression. Well, since you ask, there was an incident earlier today. A neighbor reported seeing someone matching your description snooping around the hardware store parking lot. Carter blinked, stunned by the blatant absurdity. Snooping? I was at the hardware store buying a wrench. You can check the receipt. Daniel shrugged again, as if Carter's explanation meant nothing. Sure. But you have to understand, when folks see someone they don't recognize hanging around, they get nervous. I'm not sure what's more troubling, officer. Your assumption that I'm somehow suspicious, or the fact that you're entertaining unfounded reports without evidence. The smirk returned to Daniel's face, sharper this time. It's my job to keep this town safe, Dr. Whitmore. Sometimes that means asking questions. Before Carter could respond, the diner owner, Mitchell, approached their table, wiping his hands on a towel. Mitchell was a wiry man with a perpetual scowl, but tonight, his expression was uncharacteristically tense. Everything all right here? Mitchell asked, his gaze darting between Carter and Daniels. We're just having a conversation, Daniels said smoothly. No need to worry, Mitch. Carter looked up at Mitchell, whose discomfort was palpable. It was clear he wanted no part in this, but felt compelled to intervene. If there's an issue, officer, I'd appreciate it if you'd handle it outside, Mitchell said, his voice low but firm. Don't need any trouble in my diner. Daniels leaned back, his smirk deepening. No trouble at all, just doing my due diligence. He stood, adjusting his belt with an exaggerated motion, and tipped his hat mockingly at Carter. You have a good evening now. As Daniels left, the din of the diner slowly returned, but the atmosphere remained, charged. Carter felt the eyes on him more acutely than before. He nodded his thanks to Mitchell, packed up his laptop, and left without another word. The next morning, Carter awoke to the sound of knocking, hard, insistent pounding that reverberated through the house. He opened the door to find 2 police officers standing on his porch, their expressions grim. Dr. Whitmore, one of them said, we need to ask you some questions about a break-in that occurred last night. Carter stared at them, disbelief washing over him. A break-in? Yeah, the officer continued. At the Brookfield hardware store, witnesses reported seeing someone matching your description near the scene. Carter's mind raced. The insinuation was ridiculous, but the implication was clear. Someone had deliberately placed him at the center of this. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. You're welcome to look around, Carter said evenly. But I can tell you now, you won't find anything. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping inside. They conducted a cursory search, their movements heavy with skepticism. Carter stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, willing himself to remain composed. After an hour, the officers left, finding nothing to link Carter to the crime. But the damage was already done. Word of the visit spread quickly, and by the afternoon, Carter found himself the subject of rumors that painted him as a suspect. At the local grocery store, Carter could feel the weight of judgment, conversations hushed as he walked past, heads turned away as if to avoid acknowledging him. A woman he had spoken to countless times over the years refused to meet his eyes. The final blow came when Maria, one of his few allies in town, approached him in the parking lot. Her expression was a mix of worry and regret. Carter, she said softly, I heard what happened. I know it's not true, but people are talking. They're saying things that, well, they're not good. What exactly are they saying? Carter asked, though he already knew the answer. That you don't belong here, Maria said, her voice trembling. That you're trouble. Carter felt a deep pang of hurt, not just at the words, but at the realization that even Maria, one of the few who had always been kind, seemed shaken by the rumors. I'm not going anywhere, Carter said firmly. They can say what they want, but I'm not leaving. Maria nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. Just be careful, okay? That evening, Carter sat at his kitchen table, his mind racing. The pattern was clear. Someone, or perhaps several people, was determined to drive him out of Brookfield. The whispers, the baseless accusations, the police visits, it all pointed to a coordinated effort. But Carter wasn't the type to back down. He had worked too hard, achieved too much, to let prejudice dictate his life. He began drafting a statement, outlining the events of the past few days and the growing hostility he faced. He intended to take it to the local press, to shine a light on the injustice that was threatening to consume him. As he wrote, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew his attention. He looked out the window to see a group of men standing by the edge of his property, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of a street lamp. They weren't moving, just watching. Carter's chest tightened, but he refused to let fear take hold. He turned off the lights, locked the doors, and picked up his phone. It was time to call for reinforcements. The morning air was crisp, as Carter Whitmore stood in the driveway of his modest yet elegant home, watching a group of police officers surround his property. A marked car, its lights flashing, was parked at the curb, drawing the attention of neighbors who peeked out from behind curtains or lingered at their doorsteps. The tension was tangible, a palpable force pressing against Carter's chest. Officer Daniels emerged from one of the cars, his stride deliberate and his smirk unmistakable. Behind him, 2 officers carried a search warrant. Daniels didn't bother with pleasantries as he approached. "We've received a report about stolen property matching items from your construction sites," Daniels said, holding up the warrant like a trophy. "We'll be conducting a search." Carter took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're searching my home based on a report with no evidence. This is harassment, and you know it." Daniels leaned in slightly, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm just doing my job, Dr. Whitmore. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." Carter met his gaze evenly. "You're not going to find anything because there's nothing to find, but don't think for a second I'll let this go unchallenged." Daniels shrugged, unbothered. "We'll see." The officers moved quickly, entering Carter's home while he stood on the porch, his chest tight with frustration and anger. He could feel the weight of the neighbors' stares, their judgment palpable, even without words. Some shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while others whispered amongst themselves, the rumors spreading like wildfire. Inside the house, Maria, Carter's trusted assistant and confidant, was frantic. She had been helping Carter draft his public statement when the officers barged in. "They can't do this!" Maria exclaimed, her voice shaking as she watched the officers rifling through cabinets and drawers. "This is beyond outrageous." Carter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're trying to provoke me. If I lose my composure, they win." Maria's eyes softened, but the fire in her tone remained. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself, Carter. This town is eating itself alive with its hatred." Before Carter could respond, one of the officers emerged holding a small box. "Sir, we found this in your garage," he announced, holding it up like it was a smoking gun. Carter frowned. "What is that?" Daniels stepped forward, his smirk deepening. "Looks like construction equipment with a tag from a missing shipment." Carter's confusion turned to a slow, simmering rage. "That's impossible. I manage every purchase and delivery personally." Daniels shrugged again, as if the truth were irrelevant. "It's evidence now. You'll need to come down to the station." The walk to the patrol car was one of the longest of Carter's life. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered outside, their whispers cutting deeper than he expected. "Guess all that money doesn't buy innocence," one man muttered. "Always knew he didn't belong here," another woman said, loud enough for Carter to hear. Maria's voice cut through the noise as she marched toward Daniels. "You're making a mistake. This is a setup, and you know it." Daniels turned to her, his expression indifferent. "Ma'am, you might want to step back before you find yourself in trouble too." Maria glared at him, but held her ground. You've been after Carter since the day he moved here. This isn't justice, it's a witch hunt. Carter, now seated in the back of the squad car, gave her a faint smile through the window. It's okay, Maria, he said softly. This isn't over. At the station, Carter's resolve was tested but never broken. He endured hours of questioning, the officers circling him like vultures, their tone a mix of skepticism and thinly veiled hostility. Daniels was the ringleader, his line of questioning designed to provoke. You've been pretty successful, haven't you, Dr. Whitmore? Daniels began, leaning back in his chair. Must be nice, running all those projects, living in that big house. Carter tilted his head, his voice calm. Are you trying to make a point, officer? Because I'd hate to think this is a personal vendetta. Daniels chuckled, but there was no humor in it. No vendetta, just doing my job. But you've got to admit, it's a little suspicious. Someone like you moving into our quiet little town, stirring up trouble. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. Someone like me? You mean a successful black man? Or are you referring to my education, my career? Please? Clarify. Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. No need to play the victim card here, Dr. Whitmore, we're just asking questions. Hours later, Carter was released without charges, but the damage had been done. The local news had already picked up the story, and headlines like, "Prominent businessman, questioned in theft case," were splashed across social media. The narrative Daniels had crafted was taking root, feeding the biases that already lingered in the town. As Carter stepped outside, Maria was waiting for him, her arms crossed and her face set in determination. This isn't just about you anymore, Carter, she said. They're trying to make an example out of you, and they're using their fear and prejudice to justify it. Carter nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. I know, that's why we need to fight back. That evening, Carter called a meeting with his closest allies, Maria, Mitchell, and a handful of others who had stood by him. Through the escalating tension, they gathered in his living room, the atmosphere charged with urgency. This isn't just about clearing my name, Carter began, his voice steady but resolute. This is about exposing the rot in this town, the prejudice, the corruption, all of it. Mitchell nodded, his usually gruff demeanor softened by concern. I've been here my whole life, Carter. I've seen how they treat people who don't fit their mold, but what's happening to you? It's worse than anything I've seen before. Maria leaned forward, her eyes blazing. We need to go public. The local news is already running their narrative, but we can counter it. Tell your story, Carter. Let people see the truth. Carter hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the decision weighing on him. But then he thought of the stares, the whispers, the relentless targeting. He thought of the community he had worked so hard to contribute to, only to be vilified for his success. You're right, he said finally. If they want a fight, they've got one. By midnight, Carter's statement was live, accompanied by evidence of the harassment he had endured, footage from his home security cameras showing the officers' unjustified searches, receipts proving his innocence, and testimonials from allies like Maria and Mitchell. The response was immediate, the post gaining traction as people began to question the actions of the local police and the biases fueling the accusations. But as Carter prepared for the fallout, a knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Mitchell standing there, his face pale. They're doubling down, Mitchell said. Daniels is saying you resisted arrest, that there's more evidence against you. Carter's heart sank, but his resolve hardened. Then we need to be ready. If they think they can break me, they're wrong. As the night wore on, Carter knew the battle was far from over. The forces against him were gathering strength, but so was his determination. The fight for justice had reached its tipping point, and Carter was prepared to face whatever came next. The town hall was abuzz with tension. A hastily called community meeting had packed the auditorium to capacity. Rows of wooden chairs, worn and creaky, were filled with a mix of curious onlookers, staunch supporters, and skeptics. Standing at the center of the raised platform was Carter Whitmore, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing within him. Facing him, sitting smugly at the front row with his arms crossed, was Officer Daniels. Flanked by other officers and a few local officials, Daniels had come, not out of accountability, but to gloat. To show that his authority remained untouchable. But Carter had other plans. Maria had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence and coordinating with allies. Now, with the town gathered and cameras rolling for a live broadcast, Carter was ready to take a stand. Carter stepped up to the microphone, scanning the crowd. He saw Mitchell nodding encouragement from the second row, and Maria, standing by the aisle, her expression fierce with determination. He took a deep breath. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight isn't just about me, it's about something much larger. It's about fairness, justice, and the integrity of this community." Daniels smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Here we go," he muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. A few chuckled nervously, but Carter didn't waver. "I've lived in this town for 5 years," Carter continued. "I came here because I believed it was a place where I could build not just a career, but a life. A place where my family and I could thrive. And for a while, I thought I'd found that. But over time, I began to notice something subtle. At first, a whisper here, a glance there, until it wasn't so subtle anymore." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What happened to me these past weeks wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of biases that have festered in this town for years, and the man leading the charge against me has done so not in the name of justice, but in the name of prejudice." Daniels stood abruptly, his face darkening. "Now hold on a second." "No," Carter interrupted, his voice rising. "You've had your say, you've had your chance to paint me as a villain without a shred of evidence. Now, it's my turn." Maria stepped forward and handed Carter a stack of documents and a flash drive. Carter held them up. "This is what you didn't count on, Daniels' proof. Not just of my innocence, but of your corruption." The crowd stirred, whispers growing louder. Daniels' confidence faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, scoffing. "This is a waste of time. You have nothing." Carter motioned to the projector set up at the side of the stage. The first slide illuminated the screen. A copy of the purchase receipt for the construction equipment Daniels had claimed was stolen and found in Carter's garage. It was dated weeks after the alleged theft. "This receipt proves the equipment you planted in my garage wasn't even in my possession at the time of the supposed crime," Carter said, his voice steady. "And here's the kicker, it was signed for by one of your officers." He pointed to a scrawled signature at the bottom of the receipt. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, but Carter wasn't done. He nodded to Maria, who clicked to the next slide. A series of text messages exchanged between Daniels and a local developer, notorious for opposing Carter's business projects. The messages outlined a plan to apply pressure on Carter to force him out of town. Gasps erupted from the audience. "This is the man sworn to protect and serve," Carter said, his voice growing more impassioned. "Using his position not for justice, but to target me and my family because we dared to succeed in a space he didn't think we belonged." Daniels stood again, his face a mix of anger and panic. "This is ridiculous! Those messages could be faked!" Carter stared him down, unflinching. "You'll get your chance to prove that in court." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. The mayor, who had remained neutral until now, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Officer Daniels, these are serious allegations. Do you have a response?" Daniels clenched his fists, his composure slipping. "This is a smear campaign he's trying to distract from the fact that he's guilty." Mitchell stood from the audience. "Guilty of what, Daniels? Running a business, raising a family, or just being black and successful?" Daniels turned toward him, his face twisting with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Mitchell shot back. "And so does everyone else here." The tension reached a breaking point as the room erupted into shouting, half the crowd calling for Daniels' resignation, the other half unsure what to believe. Through it all, Carter remained calm, his focus laser-sharp. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted. "This isn't just about one corrupt officer. It's about a system that allows this kind of abuse to thrive. Tonight is just the beginning. We're not going to stop until there's accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who's been targeted because of prejudice." The confrontation ended with Daniels storming out of the room, his bluster no longer enough to shield him from the mounting evidence. But as Carter watched him leave, he knew the fight was far from over. Daniels wouldn't go down without a fight, and the system he represented wouldn't either. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria approached Carter, her expression a mix of pride and worry. "You did it," she said. "But you know this isn't the end." Carter nodded, his resolve unshaken. "No, it's not. But it's a start." The night ended with a sense of both triumph and uncertainty. Carter had taken a stand and exposed the truth, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. As he walked out of the town hall, flanked by Maria and Mitchell, he felt the weight of what was to come, but also the strength of the community rallying behind him. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, and standing room crowded with townsfolk and reporters. The air was thick with tension, the type of electricity that comes when something monumental is about to happen. Carter Whitmore stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped in front of him, a picture of calm determination. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat at the prosecution's table, his smug demeanor firmly in place, his posture relaxed as though victory was assured. The judge banged the gavel. "Court is now in session. Prosecution, you may proceed." The state attorney rose, but Carter's defense attorney, Maya James, beat him to the punch. She stood, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, before the prosecution begins, the defense would like to call Officer Daniels to the stand." The room murmured with surprise, but Daniels didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked, a wolfish grin that promised he would dominate whatever game the defense was trying to play. The judge nodded. "Very well, Officer Daniels, please take the stand." Daniels swaggered to the witness box, his every movement exuding confidence. As he took his oath, Carter watched him closely, every fiber of his being focused. This was it. Months of preparation, sleepless nights, and soul-crushing doubt had led to this moment. He had to expose Daniels for who he truly was. Maya approached the stand with a composed demeanor, her voice steady. "Officer Daniels, can you confirm that you were the lead officer on the investigation involving Mr. Whitmore?" Daniels leaned back in his chair, his expression one of mock politeness. "That's correct." "And during the course of your investigation, did you personally oversee the collection of evidence?" "I did," Daniels said smoothly, folding his hands in front of him. "Would you consider yourself thorough, Officer Daniels, meticulous, in your work?" Daniels nodded confidently. "Absolutely, I take pride in doing my job right." Maya's expression didn't change, but her tone grew sharper. "Then how do you explain this?" She turned to the screen where a document was being displayed. The chain of custody form for the supposed stolen goods found in Carter's garage. The signatures were clear. Officer Daniels's name appeared twice, once at the time of the evidence's collection and once at the time of its placement in storage. Daniels shrugged. "I don't see anything unusual here, it's standard procedure." Maya nodded, feigning agreement. "Indeed. But what if I told you that the timestamp on this form doesn't match the receipt provided by the equipment supplier? According to their records, this equipment wasn't even sold until 3 days after your report claimed you collected it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniels shifted in his seat, his confident mask slipping for the first time. "That must be an error," he said, his voice less steady. Maya pressed on, her voice rising with intensity. "An error? Or a deliberate fabrication, Officer Daniels? Are you suggesting that the supplier, an established business with no ties to Mr. Whitmore, doctored their records? Or is it more plausible that you planted this evidence to frame my client?" Daniels' face darkened. "That's ridiculous. I don't need to frame anyone." "Then explain the text messages," Maya fired back, clicking to the next slide. A series of messages appeared on the screen, exchanged between Daniels and a local developer, Mr. Klein. The messages revealed plans to pressure Whitmore out of town. The implication was clear. Daniels and Klein had conspired to target Carter. Daniels' composure cracked. "Those messages are taken out of context." "Oh?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you can provide the context, because from where I stand, it looks like you abused your authority to destroy an innocent man's reputation for personal gain." The room erupted into murmurs again, but Maya silenced them with a wave of her hand. "Your Honor, the defense moves to admit these messages into evidence, along with corroborating testimony from Mr. Klein, who has agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency in his ongoing fraud investigation." Daniels shot up from his seat, his face flushed. "This is a setup." "No, Officer Daniels," Maya said. her voice cutting through his outburst like a knife. "This is justice." For the first time, Daniels looked genuinely shaken. He glanced around the courtroom, searching for an ally, but even the prosecutor was avoiding his gaze. Maya turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. Officer Daniels has not only violated his oath, but has weaponized his position against my client." The judge's stern gaze fell on Daniels. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, officer?" Daniels hesitated, his mouth opening and closing, as he grasped for an explanation. But before he could speak, Carter rose from his seat. "If I may, Your Honor?" Carter's voice was calm but powerful, commanding the room's attention. The judge nodded, and Carter turned to face Daniels. "You tried to ruin me," Carter said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because I didn't fit the image you wanted for this town. You saw my success, my family, my skin color, and you decided I didn't belong. And when I refused to shrink myself to make you comfortable, you came after me." Daniels glared at him, but the fight in his eyes had dimmed. Carter took a step closer, his voice rising. "But here's the thing about people like me. We've been through worse. We've endured centuries of people like you trying to tear us down, and we're still here. I'm still here." The room was silent, the weight of Carter's words hanging heavy in the air. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every person who's ever been told they're less than because of the color of their skin. I'm fighting for justice, not just for me, but for this entire community." The judge nodded solemnly. "Mr. Whitmore, your courage is noted, Officer Daniels. This court will consider the new evidence before rendering a decision." As the judge called for a recess, Carter returned to his seat, his heart pounding. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. Daniels sat frozen in his chair, his once impenetrable arrogance shattered. For the first time, he looked small, a man brought down by his own hatred. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers filled with a mix of awe and anticipation. Carter exchanged a glance with Maria, who nodded, her eyes shining with pride. Whatever came next, he knew he had done everything in his power to stand tall against the forces that had tried to break him. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to announce his ruling. The evidence against Officer Daniels, from the doctored chain of custody form to the incriminating text messages and the corroboration from Mr. Klein, had been overwhelming. The once confident Daniels now sat slumped in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor. The room held its collective breath as the judge cleared his throat. After careful review of the evidence presented, it is clear that Officer Daniels has violated his oath and abused his authority. This court finds his conduct reprehensible and wholly incompatible with the duties of a law enforcement officer. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is stripped of his position and referred for criminal investigation. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Carter Whitmore, seated beside his defense attorney Maya James, exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like months. Maria reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as tears filled her eyes. The nightmare they had endured was finally over, and justice had been served. Protagonist's growth. As the media swarmed outside the courthouse, Carter stood on the steps, facing the sea of cameras and microphones. He had spent weeks thinking about this moment, imagining what he would say. Now, standing before the community that had doubted him, he found his voice steady and sure. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "This is about every person who has been judged unfairly, who has been silenced, who has been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. Today, we proved that the truth matters, that justice is possible." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But this fight isn't over. What happened to me is part of a larger system that needs to change. We need accountability, we need reform, and we need to make sure that no one else goes through what my family and I have endured." The crowd erupted into applause, and Carter felt a newfound sense of purpose. The ordeal had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also ignited a fire within him. He was no longer content to focus solely on his business and his family. He wanted to use his experience to bring about real change. Systemic change. In the weeks that followed, Carter's case became a flashpoint for a national conversation about police accountability and systemic racism. His story was featured in news outlets across the country, sparking debates and rallies. Advocacy groups reached out to Carter, asking him to speak at events and join efforts to push for reform. Carter, initially hesitant, realized the power of his platform. He founded an organization dedicated to promoting racial equity and justice, focusing on providing legal assistance to those wrongfully accused and advocating for policy changes. The organization quickly gained traction, drawing support from activists, attorneys, and community leaders. Meanwhile, the fallout from the trial spread throughout the town. Officer Daniels faced criminal charges for evidence tampering and abuse of power. While Mr. Klein's shady dealings were thoroughly investigated, the police department launched an internal review, leading to the dismissal of several other officers implicated in unethical practices. The community, once divided, began to grapple with its own prejudices. Town hall meetings were held to address concerns about systemic bias, and local leaders committed to implementing diversity training and oversight measures. While the changes were slow and imperfect, they marked the beginning of a shift toward accountability. Emotional closure. For Carter, the journey toward healing was a complex one. The scars of the ordeal ran deep, and there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But he found solace in his family, whose unwavering support had carried him through the darkest days. Maria, his rock, encouraged him to embrace his new role as an advocate, even as they worked together to rebuild their lives. One evening, Carter sat on the porch with Maria, watching their children play in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over their home. For the first time in months, Carter felt a sense of peace. "We made it," Maria said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. Carter nodded. "We did. But there's so much more to do." Maria smiled. "I know, and you'll do it, but for now, just be here with us." He wrapped his arm around her, grateful for the strength they had found in each other. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, Carter felt ready to face it, setting up future possibilities. As Carter's organization grew, so did his vision for the future. He began working with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement. He partnered with schools to create educational programs that addressed implicit bias and promoted understanding. But Carter also knew that his work wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing hearts and minds. He continued to share his story, hoping to inspire others to stand up against injustice and fight for what was right. One day, as Carter prepared to speak at a rally in a neighboring city, Maria handed him a note. It was written in their daughter's handwriting. "You're my hero, Dad. I'm so proud of you." Carter folded the note and placed it in his pocket, a reminder of why he was doing this work. He stepped onto the stage, greeted by a crowd of thousands, and began to speak. "This isn't the end of my story," he said, his voice strong and clear. "This is just the beginning." The events that had unfolded in the small town were a testament to both the depths of injustice and the power of resilience. For Carter Whitmore, the journey had been transformative, a harrowing trial that tested every facet of his character and purpose. Emerging from the shadow of false accusations, Carter had not only cleared his name, but found a new mission that would define his legacy. Closing the protagonist's arc. Carter had always seen himself as a businessman, a family man, and a quiet contributor to his community. He had achieved success not through shortcuts, but through perseverance, intelligence, and integrity. Yet, the ordeal he faced revealed dimensions of himself he had never fully understood. The calm resolve he maintained in the face of systemic racism, the courage to stand up for truth, and the determination to fight back. All of these had shaped him into someone his past self might not have recognized. Though he had cleared his name, Carter knew he couldn't return to the life he had led before. The experience had marked him in ways both painful and empowering. It had ignited a fire within him, a drive to not only rebuild his life, but to become a beacon of change. The injustice he endured was not unique, and Carter's story had become a symbol for many who had suffered in silence. As he looked forward, Carter embraced his role as a leader and an advocate. He continued to grow his nonprofit, dedicating resources to legal support, public education, and community initiatives aimed at dismantling systemic racism. He remained a steadfast father and husband, finding strength in the love and unity of his family. Broader implications. Carter's personal struggle was a microcosm of a much larger issue. His ordeal shone a spotlight on the persistent problem of racial prejudice and abuse of power that pervaded institutions meant to serve and protect Officer Daniels was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a broader, systemic issue. The revelations of corruption and bias within the police department were just one part of a deeper, more pervasive problem. The trial and its aftermath forced the community, and eventually the nation, to confront uncomfortable truths. The conversation sparked by Carter's case rippled far beyond the courtroom. Media outlets and advocacy groups used his story as a case study in the urgent need for reform. Policies were reviewed, and conversations about race, power, and accountability took center stage in homes, schools, and town halls. But perhaps the most profound shift occurred within the community itself. The neighbors who had turned their backs on Carter began to reflect on their own biases. The town, once a quiet hub of denial, became a place where people began to actively seek understanding and reconciliation. It was not a perfect transformation, but it was a start. Inspiration for the audience. Carter's story was a reminder that while injustice could be overwhelming, it was not insurmountable. His resilience in the face of despair offered a powerful lesson. Even when the odds seem stacked against you, truth and perseverance can prevail. His ability to transform his pain into purpose was a call to action for others, a challenge to confront prejudice wherever it emerged. The story also highlighted the importance of collective action. While Carter's courage was at the heart of the resolution, it was the support of his family, the diligence of his attorney, and the voices of countless supporters that brought about change. The protests, the public outcry, and the willingness of allies to stand beside him were all crucial in holding the system accountable. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people united for a common cause. To the audience, the message was clear. Progress is possible, but it requires effort. It demands courage from those directly affected and solidarity from those who stand with them. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths and working together to address them. Carter's victory was not just his own. It was a shared triumph that underscored the power of resilience, truth, and collective will. Emotional impact and closing note. As Carter stood on the porch of his rebuilt home, watching his children laugh and play in the yard, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been excruciating, but it had also been illuminating. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also witnessed the best: the kindness of strangers, the unyielding support of his wife Maria, and the unwavering belief in justice that had carried him through. Carter's legacy was no longer just about the business he built or the wealth he accumulated. It was about the lives he touched, the systems he challenged, and the change he inspired. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could prevail. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the yard, Maria joined him on the porch. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched their children together in comfortable silence. After a while she spoke. "You've done so much already," she said softly, "but I know this is just the beginning." Carter smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is. There's still so much work to do, but we're ready." With that, he turned his attention back to his family. Grounding himself in the love and hope that had carried him through. Carter's story was far from over, but it was a story that would inspire others for generations to come, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of justice. The story ended with a powerful message. While challenges remain, progress is possible through resilience, truth, and unity. Carter's journey reminded everyone that even the most entrenched injustices could be confronted and overcome. The final scene, a family united, a man vindicated, and a community beginning to heal, left the audience with a sense of hope and determination to carry forward the lessons of his story.